right. Thanks for coming out, everyone. I am Ryan Slinsky. I'm one of the spinal cord physicians here at Spaulding, and I'm happy to welcome you to this Kim lecture. Before we begin tonight's program, we need to do a couple housekeeping items. Please make sure that you silence your cell phones. The bathrooms are located just around the corner by the ATMs where you came in. At the end of Dr. Hochberg's talk, we'll do a question and answer period. Please wait for someone to come with the microphone, just so that everyone can hear. It's going to be broadcast on the WebEx. If there's anything that you need during the lecture, more water, napkin, food, anything like that, feel free to flag down one of our volunteers, and they'll help you with that. And then at the end of the lecture, be sure to fill out the surveys that you were handed. So with that, I'm very excited to introduce Dr. Leigh Hochberg. So Dr. Hochberg is a vascular and critical care neurologist and neuroscientist. He is an MD, PhD. I believe he got both of those at Emory University before coming up to Massachusetts General Hospital, where he did his residency in neurology and served as chief resident before doing an additional fellowship. He is faculty at Brown. He is faculty at MGH. He has done nothing less than become a world expert in brain-computer interface. So I'm very excited to hear this talk by Dr. Hochberg. And if you would please help me welcome him.
All right. Well, thank you, Ryan, very much for that kind introduction. And thanks, everybody, for coming this evening, and to everybody on the web. Good either afternoon or evening, depending on where you may be at the moment. It's a real pleasure to be here. I spend some of my time not too far away, either kind of down the street in Boston or just down the highway in Providence. But it's not frequent enough that I get a chance to come down here to Spaulding, where I'm also on the consulting staff. And I just want to thank everybody again, not only for the opportunity to be here today, but for the great work in setting up this long-standing and really important seminar. If you haven't had a chance, please do take the opportunity to get some food, which is over there, and certainly looks great. And judging by everybody so far, it looks like it tastes great. So that's a good start. Over the next 45 minutes or so, I'm looking forward to telling you a little bit about some ongoing research in brain-computer interfaces. And ordinarily, I would welcome anybody to interrupt me at any moment. The people who are actually in charge, sitting at the table over there, have said, go from beginning to end, and then pause, and then all the questions. So I look forward to hearing those questions at the end, and so please keep them in mind. Just a moment on financial disclosures, none to report. But I am quite grateful to the multiple federal agencies, including the Department of Veterans Affairs, several institutes of the NIH, and some philanthropies for their continuing support of this research. And I will point out kind of what's bolded at the bottom, which is a standard regulatory phrase that what I'm going to be telling you about today, I think without exception, certainly everything related to the BrainGate realm. Maybe one of the things that I'll mention is not an investigational device of one of my colleagues' research, but the rest of this really is in the research realm, not yet clinically available, and it's with feedback from people in this room and from others in the continuing testing of this device that we hope in some point in the future will lead to become a device that will be helpful for people with paralysis. I'm just going to look over to the right and do a quick check to make sure that the audio is working well and can hear. Nod if you can hear. Don't nod if you don't hear. Yes, we got thumbs up. Okay, very good. Most important disclosure that I have by far, though, are the great group of people who I get to work with every day. These are folks from across a series of disciplines and institutions. I'll mention some of those institutions a little bit later, but engineering, computer science, applied mathematics, statistics, neurology, neurosurgery, neuroscience, and any number of other subspecialties of science and engineering that are all required to make the system that we're actively developing and testing work, and as is true for many other forms of rehabilitation, medicine, and research. But as is often the case, if you don't know already, when you see slides like this, you should take a quick look at the faces that you see and then ignore them, because all of the actual work was done by all the people on the right side of the slide whose names you see, who are our collaborators and our students, including our undergrads, graduate students, and postdocs, many of whom have been working on this for quite some time. So as Ryan mentioned, I spent some of my time as a vascular and critical care neurologist, and it's often helpful for me, at least, to begin with a clinical vignette, that is to tell you a little bit about a patient. So in 1995, there was a woman who was about 42 years old with no significant past medical history, who was tending to her vegetable garden when she suddenly got a bit dizzy. She went inside and sat on the couch next to her then 10-year-old son, and she got a little bit more dizzy. And then she couldn't move the right side of her body, and then she couldn't move the left side of her body, and then she couldn't speak. She was diagnosed as being in a coma initially. But 12 hours later, she was transferred to Mass General Hospital, and this 95-96 was about the first year of doing a particular type of MRI called a diffusion weighted image, which is particularly good for looking for acute strokes. All right, looking at Miguel, we're going up, okay. Could I speak closer to the microphone? I will move the microphone. Let's see, that's how we do. Is that a little better? Yes, okay, good, thank you. You bet, and certainly speak up if I should change anything else. She came to Mass General, had one of these MRI scans, and what's shown here, without turning anybody into a neuroradiologist, on these pictures of the brain, which are slices kind of from the chin going up to the top of the head, gray is good and white is bad. And most of her brain is gray on these pictures, but there's one part that I'll focus in on, and actually I'll just go back so you can see it. That one part that you may see on the middle row all the way on the left, which is bright white, that's the brain stem, and the pons in particular. She had had a tear of an artery in the back of the neck, and then a blood clot that formed in another artery, called the basilar artery, and was initially, as mentioned, diagnosed as being in a coma. When she arrived at MGH, then junior neurology resident had the good insight to ask her to look up, and she did, and then look down, and she did, indicating that she was not in a coma at all. She was awake and alert, and she could hear everything, and she could feel everything, but she couldn't move, and she couldn't speak. It's for people who've had a stroke, such as the one that she's had, for people with cervical spinal cord injury, and for other people whose injuries or illnesses of the nervous system have resulted in a decreased ability or perhaps an inability to move and perhaps also to speak, that we and others are hoping to test and further develop a technology that could restore some degree of mobility and communication. And I'll tell you more about that as we go through. So I'm going to tell you about an emerging and we hope innovative, but certainly mildly complex technology. And in the development of any medical technology, it's often important to come back to some very basic goals, to establish what they are and to be able to describe them. And when things get a little bit more complex than maybe they should, to come back to what the goals are. So for her, for other people who have had similar strokes, as a vascular and critical care neurologist, I would very much like to be able to say, I'm sorry that this happened, but you'll be able to communicate again easily tomorrow. This happened on Monday. We'd love to be able to say by Tuesday, your ability to communicate will be restored. For somebody who's had a cervical spinal cord injury or some other type of stroke, to be able to tell that person that they'll be able to move again confidently tomorrow would be wonderful. The types of technologies that I'll be describing or may also in the future be helpful for people with neurodegenerative diseases, including ALS or amyotrophic lateral sclerosis or Lou Gehrig's disease. And as people who have that particular disorder may slowly be losing the ability to move and the ability to speak, I and our team would like to say with confidence that you will never lose the ability to communicate. Now, none of these statements can be made today, but keeping them in mind is where I hope we're headed. And it's worth noting that nothing on the slide says anything about technology. They're a clinical goal, they're an outcome, they're a goal that would hopefully be something that's desired by anybody whose condition is mentioned up there. And as we think about the technologies that I'll describe, we always come back to, are we on the right track? Is this really where we're headed? Or is there something else that might be able to achieve the same goal? So why a brain-computer interface? Why are we talking about a brain-computer interface today? So there's any number of disorders that could cause an inability to move and perhaps an inability to speak. Some of them are listed there on the left, including spinal cord injury. And of course, we're at the model systems, the spinal cord injury model systems seminar today. At least hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people affected worldwide with these disorders. And I will, with some confidence and with great respect for the assistive technology community, I'll just say outright that the assistive technology that are available today, they are limited and not nearly as effective as many people would want them to be. So as we think about the intention to move, that little green dot on the screen is to represent how movement, where movement begins, kind of a random dot placed in the brain at the moment. And we know that the intention to move or to make a voluntary movement of the arm or hand finds its way from the brain down to the brainstem and then down through the spinal cord. And we can think kind of in a cartoon diagram fashion of any type of injury or illness as just being a red X. That red X meaning that there's still the desire and the intention to move, but the inability for those signals from one part of the brain to find their way down to the rest of the nervous system that would actually enable that movement. Now, undoubtedly, you've all heard of and perhaps even taken part in research where part of the goal is to repair the injury or the illness kind of where that red X is, to repair the neural injury. And that's very important research, and I hope that it continues to make progress. What we'll talk about tonight is a different approach. It's an engineering approach, knowing that if we can record and understand the intention to move and the desire to move from somewhere in the nervous system, then we can reroute that signal to its target or to a other useful target, which may be a computer or it may be somebody's own limb. And by doing that, creating the equivalent of a patch cord, if you will, we hope to be able to re-enable the ability to turn thought back into action. So neural interface systems, or BCIs, or brain-computer interfaces, sometimes called brain-machine interfaces, there are many of them that have been developed over the past 10 or 15 years. These three different types, or these three different components, are common to all types of brain-computer interfaces, or BCIs, as I may say. So we begin with a person. I'm a neurologist, so that is my iconic representation of a person. And this is somebody who we're hoping that we can try to understand just one thing, which is how are they trying to move their hand? What is their intention to move? Now, in order to do that, there are a few questions that we need to answer. The first is, what type of signal do we want to record? It turns out there's lots of different signals in the brain. There's electrical signals, there's chemical signals, there's signals that are related to blood flow. And we have to think a little bit about which of those signals are we interested in recording. And then once we've decided on a signal, then we can decide what areas of the brain we want to record from. Turns out that there's at least a dozen different parts of the brain that are involved in the control of voluntary movement. And then once we have a signal and an area or areas of the brain decided, then we choose a sensor or a technology that allows us to get that signal out from the right place at the right time, or the right places at the right time. Once we've got a signal in hand, then we take that signal and we put it into a black box. And that black box is where my friends and colleagues in the field of computational neuroscience spend all of their time in what is an incredibly fun and important pursuit of trying to understand the language of the nervous system, trying to understand what does all of these neuronal brain cell activities mean, and can we, in our lingo, decode that brain activity. So not only do we understand what that brain activity means, but in real time convert that intention to move and the brain activity associated with that intention to move back into the actual movement. So what's up on the screen there is, can we understand the encoding of individual neuron or brain cell activities, and then can we decode it and turn it back into hand motion, for example. But before we leave our bench, or before we leave our wherever it is that we're thinking of developing a brain-computer interface, we do have to think about what we hope that technology will actually do. So for the woman whose MRI I showed you just a moment ago, and I'll tell you more about her in a little bit, it might be helpful, I suspect it would be helpful, to restore the ability to type on a computer screen or to browse the internet for education or entertainment, to have better control over a smart home, and any number of other technologies that are listed there. For people who have lost a limb as a result of trauma or vascular disease, there have been wonderful prosthetic limbs that have been developed, including prosthetic upper extremities developed over the past 10 years or so. The controllers for those limbs are still fairly simple, maybe a switch. It may be something that can keep track of how the foot is moving. So some people who are using these really impressive upper extremity prosthetics may be moving their foot in order to control that upper extremity. And wouldn't it be better if they were just thinking about using their arm or hand? Another hope, in some ways, the dream for some of these technologies is to reconnect brain to limb by taking the intention to move the signals out of the brain and routing them back to the limb that's currently unable to move. There's lots of other possibilities for these technologies, which we can talk about if interested during the discussion section, but that's some of what we hope to achieve with the assistive technologies. So this is a non-human primate. This is a monkey, as you all recognize without me telling you. And he's up there really to represent about a half century's worth of fundamental neuroscience. And I should kind of jump out to say fundamental publicly funded neuroscience. And what he's doing up there is playing a video game. It turns out that it's fairly straightforward to teach a happy, healthy monkey to play a video game. As long as you know what juice they like to have as a reward, they can hop in a chair, put their hand on a joystick, and move their hand right and left to control a cursor on a computer screen. And they'll do that for hours on end, so long as they're getting the juice reward that encourages them to continue to do that. That type of research going on for more than 50 years has allowed basic fundamental neuroscientists to take single electrodes and then to place them in different areas of the brain to learn how one neuron at a time is related or has an impact on the control of the arm or the hand. So one can imagine if you're listening to the brain activity that is of one neuron while an animal's moving his hand, there's a lot that can be learned about what that neuron does for a living and whether it helps to move the hand and how it helps to move the hand. And much of what we know as a scientific and clinical community about how people control their arms and hands is the result of these decades of kind of very straightforward one neuron at a time research. Turns out that people, those of us here in the room, have about 88 billion neurons. I don't know who counted. I don't know how that number was actually come up. Sometimes people say 100 billion, 88 billion is the common number. You can imagine that recording one out of 88 billion allows you to make progress fairly slowly. So what was needed was a way to record at least a few individual neurons in the brain simultaneously so that we could learn more about fundamental movement and how, at least animals to begin with, make a movement. So thankfully, in the early 1990s, a gentleman named Dick Norman at the University of Utah created something known generally as the Utah Ray. It's had some other names as well. There's some companies that have manufactured it over the years, most recently BlackRock, and as well as, and we've been using this, as I'll tell you in a bit, in our BrainGate research. I know that you can't see this. Part of that is the point. The little thing that I'm holding up that you can't see because it's too small. It's about 4 by 4 millimeters, which is probably about the quarter of the size of the nail on your little finger. In that little 4x4 millimeter baby aspirin size platform are 100 of these tiny electrodes. 96 of them are active. They can be placed on the top of the brain and tapped into the brain, allowing, at least in theory, a few dozen, if not 100 or more individual neurons to be recorded simultaneously. This is almost the end of the scientific history. Please do not tell anybody who taught me about the actual 50 years of history that I just skipped through it in 3 minutes. The way that this technology gets into the brain is a part of the skull is removed, put on the sterile table. The array, much smaller than it appears there, is tapped into the top of the brain. The piece of bone is put back. A little bit of titanium is put there to keep the pieces of bone approximated. The skin's put back. And in this technology, at least today, there's the array in the brain with its 100 electrodes, some fine wires, and as you'll see in a bit, a small connector, which is the part you may be able to see in what I'm holding up, that protrudes through the scalp that allows us to get access to listen to that brain activity. And I'll give you a hint that that is towards the end going to, we hope, soon go away as well. That is the percutaneous part. Almost done with our history. In about 2000, 2001, Misha Soraya, who was an MD PhD student at Brown University working in John Donahue's lab, taught one of these happy, healthy monkeys to play a video game. Was then able to take one of these types of arrays that could record the brain activity. And as I was describing before, to build that black box, to build the map, to build the decoder that could predict the animal's hand movements based only on the brain activity. A few moments later, after that map was built, after the computer knew what the animal's hand was actually doing, they disconnected the joystick. And from that moment forward, the data that you're seeing up there, that is the dot that you see moving, is what we'd refer to as a neural cursor. It's a cursor that's moving not as the result of a joystick, but the result of brain activity alone, or the result of the intended movement as decoded in real time from the brain activity. So this, which was published in 2002, was the first demonstration of a two-dimensional cursor on a screen being moved by, if you will, informally brain power alone. It was very exciting. Lots of other groups, some of which are mentioned there, that were doing similar research and continued to advance this. And this became the proof of concept that it might be possible to decode and understand in real time intended movement of the arm and hand just by recording a few dozen neurons or brain cells. Now, clearly, the goal was not to prove that happy, healthy monkeys could play video games with their mind. It's not why there's been an investment, an important investment in both neuroscience and engineering over the several decades to get to that point. The reason for that, and the reason for some of the neural prosthesis project, which had been sponsored by NIH and similar research that had been supported and continues to be supported by both the NIH and the Department of Veterans Affairs, was to see if a technology could be developed that might be helpful for people with paralysis. So on the basis of that proof of concept, we launched in 2004 something known as the BrainGate pilot clinical trials. And the goal of what is the ongoing trial today is to determine whether it's both safe and possible that somebody with tetraplegia might be able to control a cursor on a computer screen or some other technology, such as a robot arm or perhaps even their own arm, simply by thinking about the movement of their own hand. And if everything works the way it's supposed to, one of these arrays, which I have here, I'm happy to show anybody who's here a little bit later, by placing one or two of those arrays into the brain, into the motor cortex, part of the brain that ordinarily controls arm and hand movement, bringing those signals to the outside, decoding those signals in real time. Hopefully, the participants in our clinical trial would be able to control a cursor on a screen or some other external technology. And doing so simply by thinking about the movement of their own hand. I'll mention a little more in a bit, but there have been 13 participants to date in our ongoing BrainGate trial, and listed numbers there few of us met a few weeks ago that are engaged in this research across the country, and we think we have these numbers right, at least at the moment, of the number of participants that have been in the various trials that used a Utah array. That's the group at the top, including our BrainGate collaboration, University of Pittsburgh, Caltech, Ohio State, and Johns Hopkins. There's the same array is being used in Spain, San Sebastian, in a stroke study, and a similar technology that I'll mention, somewhat similar technology that I'll mention being used in Utrecht recently. So we're now at the point that there's at least 21, 22 or so folks who have been engaged in similar BrainGate-like trials and trials using this particular array. This is a standard clinical trial slide. The people who are being recruited to join us in the BrainGate study are adults who have limited or no use of their hands as a result of spinal cord injury, stroke, that is brainstem stroke, muscular dystrophy or motor neuron disease, that is ALS. The folks in the trial have to be at least a year out from their injury or a diagnosis, need to be able to communicate, but not necessarily be able to speak. So if somebody's able to use their eyes to communicate sufficiently, we can recruit them to the trial. And they need to live within about 3 hours of one of our trial sites being here in New England, Boston, Providence, in Cleveland, or in Palo Alto, as a Case Western or Stanford. And the reason for that 3-hour drive time is that after the device is placed, which of course happens in a sterile operating room, our participants return home, and the rest of the research occurs in their place of residence, whether it be their own home or assisted care facility, which means that the research that we're doing is happening in people's living rooms, or their bedrooms, or the common room of the assisted care facility that they may be living in. And that, for us, has been incredibly helpful, because most research, for good reason, occurs in a university laboratory or a hospital environment, which is the one that we're in here today. And one can very carefully control the research, both electrically and get rid of external electrical noise, and know that everything's going to work as best as possible because there's a lock on that door and we have the key. We decided from the very beginning that we would be doing this research in people's homes and learning how well this technology works where it actually matters, which is where people live, and learning along the way and adapting the system to the varieties of environments that people are living in, the different things in their living rooms, the dogs who appear every so often and chew through the cables. These are important things to learn about. So let me introduce you to the first participant in this study. It's a gentleman who was 21 when he was breaking up a fight at a beach party around July 4th and was stabbed in the middle of that fight in the back of the neck and had a cervical spinal cord injury. He joined us in the trial about 2.5 years later. I'm going to do a quick check to see. All right, my cursor is not, no, is my cursor visible? Yeah, sort of. So you see his head here. There's a tiny pedestal that you can't see that's protruding from the top of his head. This big cable is helping to record the neural activity. We'll make that go away a little bit later, I hope. And you're going to see and hear him talking as he tries to move the cursor on the computer screen.
Okay, so here's the Cyberkinetics desktop. What are you going to do first?
I'm gonna open my email first.
Okay.
I'm gonna open the first one.
You're going to open the first one.
And it says, congratulations, you are doing a great job.
Very good.
I'm gonna open the second email.
Okay.
This one says, hi, we'll talk soon.
Great. Now can you exit back to the Cyberkinetics desktop?
I'm gonna exit.
You're going to exit. Excellent. So what's next?
Next, I'd like to draw a circle.
You're going to draw a circle. Wow.
Because of his injury, he hasn't been able to explore that ability. So that's an inkwell at the bottom and an eraser up at the top.
Try that again.
Okay.
So I tried to draw something.
All right, let's try it again.
About the movie.
Here we go.
Whoops.
And that's not a.
You avoided the eraser that time.
He saw the obstacle. He was
It's the
able to.
best circle I can do. I'm going to exit.
Okay.
we asked him to do some other things for about 8 minutes.
Going to draw a circle.
And then we asked
All right.
him to draw circles.
Excellent. Now let's try going back to the desktop.
Able to do that.
Very good.
I'll show you some other virtual devices being controlled, but we wanted right from the very beginning to see if a physical device could be controlled as well. So you're looking at a prosthetic hand that's used for people with transradial amputation. You'll see our participant again in a moment. You'll hear him say open and close, so we know what it is he's trying to do with the hand. And it dawns on me, if the audio is adequate, you may hear his response to being able to do this. I'm looking carefully around the room at the moment. There may be, for any children in the room, one word here, if it's audible, that is inappropriate. For the children in the room, for anybody who's on the webcast, this is the moment for briefly explicit audio, I think is the right phrase.
Close. Holy shit. Open. Close. Nice. Open. Close. Not bad, man. Not bad at all. Close.
Well, I always like seeing that video and hearing his response to it. But from an engineering standpoint, that's what would be called a state decision. That open and close is really simple. And we, as a field, need to be able to do a lot better than that if this were to become a medical device in the future. So this is an MRI again, spinning around a little bit. And what you'll notice, if my cursor kind of goes across, you recognize the brain up at the top. This is the brain stem, and this is the spinal cord down here. This large kind of wedge is the stroke that had occurred 9 years earlier in the woman whose MRI I showed you just a little while ago. And even from a kind of, without a neuroradiology or neurology background, you get the sense that this is a hole, and this hole nearly completely disconnects a perfectly functioning brain from an otherwise perfectly functioning body. So if we can tap into that perfectly functioning brain, then we may be able to restore some of her ability to control external devices. I'm going to tell you a little bit more. I'll show you a picture of her and a movie of her in just a little bit, but I do want you to hear a little bit of what this brain activity sounds like. So you're going to hear one of our research assistants and research technicians asking her to try to do something with her hand that she's unable to do. She had one of these arrays placed in her motor cortex, point to the proper side, and the ticking you'll hear in the background is the neural activity.
Close your hand. Relax. Open your hand. Relax. Close your hand. Relax. Open your hand.
So I could listen to that all day and all night. Yeah, that is Mozart as far as I'm concerned. We have a scientific name for that. That is a very pretty neuron. That is one that we all immediately understand. It is trying to open the hand. It's involved in the attempt to open the hand. And if we can clearly decode what that neuron is trying to do. There are other neurons. The relationship to what it's trying to do to arm and hand movement may be a little bit more complicated, but thankfully we have computers and math that can help us to understand what that activity is. Even though she had no voluntary control of her hand, we knew the moment that she was trying to move her hand, we could tell from her brain activity, from the neural activity, that in fact she was trying to move her hand. And that's what allows us to build a decoder and to build a system that would potentially allow her to control an external device. So there she is in the upper left. This is 14 years after she had had a stroke. What she is doing is trying with her right hand, for which there's a little bit of movement every so often. She's trying to reach out and grasp the little raspberry ice cream cone looking targets that we put up there. And as she's trying to do that, the robot arm is moving towards the target, and as she's reaching out and trying to grab it, it's squeezing the hand. Similarly, in the lower right-hand corner, you can't see the gentleman who's there, 65-year-old gentleman who had a very similar stroke, a basilar stroke that resulted in a stroke in the pons. And he is controlling the DECA second generation here prosthetic hand and arm. And he, again, slowly, imperfectly, but both of them are able to navigate in 3 dimensions with this kind of version of the technology where it was several years ago to get to a kind of typical workspace in front of a desk. It's worth noting that not only was she doing this 14 years after her stroke, speaking of the fact that the brain activity is still trying to control the arm, and we can harness that, but it's also 5 years after the device was placed in the brain, which speaks to the potential for this to be a clinically useful device for an extended period of time, which of course is important. So we asked her what she would like to do with this technology, and she said that she'd like to be able to take a drink. We said, okay. So I went to the coffee shop down the street and got a cinnamon latte, which is a very important scientific point. Poured it into the thermos, and she's attempting to reach out and grab that thermos. Now, because of the stroke that she had, she's unable to move about her trunk, either left, right, or forward, back. So the first thing she has to do is really line up that thermos that'll be straight in front of her so that when she decides to bring it towards her, the straw will be closer to her mouth. So she's now bringing it back towards her again by thinking about the movement of her own hand. Next, she's going to pronate or turn her wrist or the robot's wrist to put the straw into her mouth. The next 30 seconds or so don't have much to do with brain-computer interfaces or technologies, a lot to do with her still profound physical disability. She has a limited ability and sip power because of her stroke, so it takes a while for the cinnamon latte to get into the straw. While she's doing this, I'll tell you that that's one of our team's engineers in the background, and he was under strict instruction to show no emotion. And she'll move this straw around just a little bit more and be able to take the sip of that latte. Now, as you all realize, that was not the first time in nearly 15 years that she had had something to drink. But it was the first time in 14 plus years that she was able to do so really solely of her own volition without somebody else not only pouring the cinnamon latte into the thermos and putting the thermos on the holder of the cup holder that's attached to the headrest of a wheelchair and putting the straw into her mouth, which is part of why she had that reaction. And she was happy and we were happy, and the guy who was clapping was in some trouble, but that's it. This is up here just as a side note. I don't need to see additional pictures of myself, but whether it's the Boston Globe, the Wall Street Journal, or more, perhaps on different ends of the spectrum, PBS NewsHour or Fox News, regardless of one's political leanings, this attempt and progress in restoring mobility and communication seems to be met with a positive response. So it is good for the rehab community and all of us here that at least so far this ongoing research that many of you are here and online have been involved with, and many of the scientists and others who are around the room are pursuing continues to be supported regardless of which end of the political spectrum one might tend towards. Let me talk about a couple other brain-computer interface research endeavors. So the first is using a different type of signal called an EEG. That is a scalp-based signal that can be recorded at the top of the brain, or sorry, the top of the head. And there has been one prospective clinical trial of a brain-computer interface, this done by John Wolpaw and his colleagues at the Wadsworth Center. Really a tremendous effort. This supported by the VA, by the Department of Veterans Affairs. As mentioned, the first prospective multi-site BCI trial published a little over a year ago. And it allowed several people who were seeing letters flash in front of them. There's a way to decode the brain activity and to choose which letter somebody's paying attention to, allowed people in this trial to type about 3 letters per minute. And they used the technology about an hour and 20 minutes a day and about 2 days a week. Tremendous research. It took a long time to get this done. And this for EEG brain-computer interfaces performed as a kind of standard trial really has been the state of the art. Another technology using a implanted electrode, that is one that does require neurosurgery and sits on top of the brain, was done by Mariska Vansitel and Nick Ramsey in Utrecht. In this report from late 2016, there was a woman with ALS with no functional use of her hands who had one of these ECOG arrays, as they're known, placed on top of the brain. And similarly, this fully implanted technology, which is really a big step forward, allowed her, using a similar typing interface, to type about 2 letters per minute. So from a BCI, brain-computer interface standpoint, those 2 studies are, for their respective technologies, the state of the art when used by people with paralysis. Returning to our BrainGate research, and I'll make comparisons, or you'll see some comparisons in a moment. This is a gentleman with ALS in his home. Most importantly, we're not in a lab, that's his couch. He's thinking about using his own hand, but he's able to move. So he's got control of the white dot, and he's clicking on the red dot wherever it appears. And you get the sense that, compared to the other videos I was showing you, we're getting a little bit better with time and decoding the brain activity and allowing somebody with tetraplegia to control that external device. Here in some work that was published in 2017, in a woman with ALS here, she is typing the phrase at the top of the screen, and she's using an interesting keyboard. You put it up that keyboard in MATLAB, that's a computer program that's quite useful in science. The optimized keyboard has common letters, letters commonly used in the English alphabet across the middle, like CAT there. And here she's pointing and clicking, or she's pointing and dwelling to take that phrase. And in this report with 3 people were able to type up to 39 correct characters per minute without any board prediction that we don't know is common in most communication methods. And that is about 10 times faster than the best as other technology-based brain paralysis. So when we saw this, which was fairly rapid control and pointing and clicking for typing, we began to ask ourselves, so why are we spending time as neuroscientists, neuroengineers, creating new keyboards? There's an entire industry that creates communication interfaces, industry that's creating tablet computers. So we asked 2 of our participants. The first thing that we did is we got on a commonly used electronic shopping platform, trying to maintain my academic credentials and not say outright what the name of that platform is, something.com. Ordered 2 Google Nexus tablets, and they arrived 48 hours later. And a woman in the upper left who has ALS has 1 array in the brain and therefore 1 cable. Gentleman with ALS in the lower right, 2 arrays in the brain, 2 cables. He is using completely unmodified email program app on that tablet. He is searching on YouTube, searching to learn more about ALS. And this really is an example of getting back to those mission statements that I listed at the beginning. And I hope to be able to tell somebody with ALS they will never lose the ability to communicate. They will be able to use the exact same tablet computers they were using before the onset of their disease or injury. One question you may be asking yourself is, how long does it take to either learn how to use this technology or for the computer to learn about the brain signals? So I'll just play you a video game, or show you a video of a video game. in a moment. This is a participant with cervical spinal cord injury. As I press play here, he is trying to control the cursor on the screen, but our computer at time 0 knows nothing. It is learning from the moment I press play. And about every 3 seconds or so, it's comparing his brain to the known intended movement, because the computer knows which target is lit up. Right now, it knows that the southwest target over there is lit up, and it's constantly comparing the brain activity to his to get to that target. And I've now said enough words and let enough time go by, which is 35, 36 seconds. You probably appreciate that there's already two-dimensional control over it. So the amount of time that it took our computer with the new approach to learn what these brain signals mean, we begin to see some control in tens of seconds. And if we were to keep this going for no more than 4 minutes, we would get to a plateau where the quality of the decoding was as good as really any point ever. So when we think back to those missions, somebody with ALS, we never lose people who communicate. Somebody with cervical spinal cord injury or brain stroke will be able to communicate or move tomorrow. Part of that, the speed, the tomorrow part, is based on the speed with which we think our computer now, or the algorithm, do it in understand. That's how fast the computer can learn. Another question is how long can a person, or how quickly can a person learn to do this? You're looking at the video of the first time that this gentleman, who also has cervical spinal cord injury, is trying to control the cursor on the screen just by thinking about his hand movement. And just like before, the computer knows nothing at time point 0. The cursor is floating around, not really making much progress. He is constantly trying to control that cursor on the screen. And if we let a few more moments go by, what will begin to appear, so we kind of cross 30 seconds or so, is he now has more than a little bit, kind of a fair amount of two-dimensional control of that cursor, just by thinking about the movement of his own hand. And if, again, we let this go for another 3 or 4 minutes, that cursor control will be as good as anything we've ever seen in our trial, and as good as it's going to get at this point. So really exciting. He had never used a brain-computer interface before, really exciting to us. And within that first minute, he was acquiring the ability to control the cursor on the screen just by thinking about the movement of his own hand. Now, there's one caveat. I told you this was the first time that he and we ever tried to do this, the first time we tried to use a brain-computer interface. What actually happened was that everybody was in the room, they pressed play, and for a minute or more, the cursor was kind of wobbling around and not really moving. And as happens sometimes in science, the faces were getting a little bit concerned, and because things weren't working. And then he said, "When should I start?" And the folks in the room said, "How about now?" And kind of hit play again, and then that was the video that you saw. We talked a little bit about the hope to reconnect brain to limb together with our colleagues at the Case Western Reserve University and the Cleveland FES Center. This is a gentleman with cervical spinal cord injury.
Open your hand.
Right now using the BrainGate system with an FES, that is a functional exercise.
Close your hand.
Turned off. Got about 8 pairs of muscles that were implanted with electrodes.
Reach out.
And you can see he's got just a little bit of flexion extension about the elbow. He's now going to be asked to make these same movements. We don't have muscles about the shoulder implanted, but as he's thinking about lifting his own hand, under neural control, there's a robotic assistive device, a mobile arm support that's moving. Now it's his muscles that are being stimulated. He's able to flex and extend his elbow, able to open and close his hand under his own neural power as we decode the neural activity. And
lower your arm.
Really
Raise your arm.
rudimentary, still slow, not dexterous movement, but we think a step towards showing that with just a little bit of brain activity recorded and the right implanted technologies, we might be able to restore and reanimate a paralyzed limb. She wanted a cinnamon latte. His vote was for mashed potatoes. obliged. And this is him again, thinking about moving his own arm support robot, if you will, that's elevating his shoulder, but the flexion extension of his elbow is under his own kind of BrainGate and FES provided power. So everything I've shown you so far requires a room that looks a little bit like the one that's on the screen. There's the participant in our study, extraordinary participants in our study. There's something that's attached to the top of the head. There's some equipment that's on the back of the wheelchair. There's a bunch of computers on a cart. And there's Katie. That is, there's a research assistant who is savvy in one of the computer programming languages that can make this all work. And all of those things need to disappear for this to become an actual medical technology. So there's some progress that's being made along those lines. First, one of the things that I carry in my pocket, thanks to colleagues at Brown University, Archer D'Amico and Dave Borton and others, there is, and it's been tested in animals, a wireless transmitter that can be attached to that pedestal and can wirelessly transmit the neural activity. This is something that we're allowed to use in our clinical trial now. The next stage for this, much like a deep brain stimulator or a cardiac pacemaker, is to have a fully implanted system. That's the last thing that I carry around in my pocket, which is something like this, that can be fully implanted under the scalp, in the skull, allowing the full bandwidth, all that neural activity to be beamed without something sticking through the scalp. We're continuing to work on this. This has been tested in animals. It has, we hope, and thanks to the NIH Brain Initiative and the Department of Veterans Affairs, we're making progress in doing some of the medical testing that would be required before submitting this device for regulatory evaluation and hopefully approval. And we hope that within a year or so, we would be in the condition to begin a clinical trial of this fully implanted BrainGate device. But that's something that we're aiming towards. So to wrap up, just before we get to some questions, our BrainGate team and others around the country are looking to fully neuroengineered devices that can intuitively, easily, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, restore communication, restore mobility, to improve the communication systems by using the standard communication tablet computers or other technologies that are already available today, to allow for control over prosthetic or robotic assistive devices, and to reconnect brain to limb using a combination of BrainGate recording systems and decoding systems and implanted functional electrical stimulation technologies. There's still a lot of work to do. This is definitely still research. All those words that are up there intended to remind me of all of the different areas that we need to continue to focus on in order to get this from where it is today, which is what I believe to be a promising and exciting research endeavor that really continues to benefit from the extraordinary participants in our study who not only are telling us whether things are working well or what we need to work on better, and they tell us whether it's easy or whether it's difficult. Because when I see a cursor moving nicely on a computer screen, I don't know whether it's hard to do that or easy to do that, but we get feedback right then and there. And it's really been from that guidance that we've had from the wonderful participants and will continue to have in our study that we can send our research in the right direction and learn how to get this right. And as we continue to do that, there's some of our team hard at work. Thanks again to everybody who's here this evening. Thanks again for those on the web who are listening in. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I look forward to answering any questions that you may have. Thanks very much. And I believe I'll look over at Ryan for direction. Or Jenny, oh yes, hi.
You're leaving the, say a stroke or a spinal injury, are you effectively bypassing the trauma area that's no longer functioning and going to the muscles that would be below that?
The one way to think of it is just like that. This is a patch cord. There's a part of the nervous system that works. There's a part of the nervous system that's been injured that's preventing the signals from getting beyond it. And there's another part of the nervous system below that, if you will, that works. And we're trying to, for example, reconnect those two parts of the nervous system, which could be the brain that's still trying to control hand movement and the muscles or some other part of the nervous system that controls the arm or the hand.
Okay. There's an article, it was July 10th, 2018, about a doctor over at, anyway, he's over at Mass General now. He's working with a pediatric surgeon from Children's Hospital to repair baby infant hearts with heart attacks, and that what they're using is mitochondria, healthy mitochondria, from the babies themselves, and rather than using the machines that have like a 65% success rate that are keeping them breathing, they've done the mitochondria, and they found that a number of kids, at least at the date of this article, had basically gotten better within 2 days because they were having billions of healthy mitochondria, and the energy level in the cells was restored. And that apparently they don't have, the mitochondria go after what they're supposed to go after. It's like they already know their mission genetically, and they make things healthier. And I just was wondering, the doctor who was doing the research on the strokes, if you say by analogy, could you try mitochondria to make that healthier at the site of a trauma, and see if that would improve things too? Are they doing that with adults or with any? I mean, it's over at children's right now, but.
So thanks for your question. I look forward to learning more about that research. I put that research into the really important category of efforts to try to fix the problem exactly where it is, that is to repair the nervous system itself, which is a really important endeavor. In some ways, our job is much simpler, in that we can use engineering approaches and we can control much of how we deal with the information, how we record the information, how we stimulate. And one of the exciting parts we think about doing that is because it is in many ways simpler than the very complex and more difficult to control biological repairs, we're hoping that we can make progress that much more quickly. On the other hand, if there are techniques, and as they get developed, and hopefully they will, that can repair the nervous system kind of in situ, that is exactly where the injury is, that's a wonderful advance.
He did it out of absolute frustration, and it worked. They were surprised.
Thank you. All right, I see on the web by Dr. Solinsky.
Yeah, so we have one from the web. It is, how long can subjects have the chip implanted for?
The clinical trial, as we have it written, is with the expectation that everybody will be in the trial for at least a year, and they can be in the trial for up to 6 years. There's been one person who was in the trial for more than 5 years. There are at least 2 others, maybe 3 others who have been in the trial for at least 3 years. I know of one person, possibly one person that's listening in tonight on the web, who has also had an array in, one of these arrays in for at least 5 years. And so there's a growing understanding in the body of literature that allows us to understand how long the arrays can potentially stay in. So that's the brief answer to the question. But when folks join us in the trial, the expectation is to be in for at least a year, and then with permission and continued interest, we can continue for longer than that. Looking over at the web team, who's, oh, yes, please.
Curious if you have any thoughts or concerns about possibly that if the body does indeed seek to regenerate the trauma site with concern as to whether or not this type of computer interface will cause the body to actually become dependent on that interface and not seek to regenerate trauma.
It's a great question. So currently in the state of the research, we've been placing these devices a year or more, sometimes 9 years after the initial injury. So at that point, years later, while there is still regenerative ability and ability to continue to make progress with the additional rehabilitation therapies, I'm less concerned about the device's interference with whatever the next advance may be. In fact, there's some kind of very anecdotal appreciation, not just in what we've been doing, but what a couple other people around the country have been doing, that some of the folks in the trial sometimes are at least telling us that they're feeling that there may be some improvements possibly that are happening. Now, I don't know that I can report that with any confidence at this moment, but being able to use a part of the brain that had become disconnected as the result of the underlying injury or illness, again, is probably a good thing, at least from a neuroscience and repair standpoint. I don't know the answer to your question for sure, whether it would cause injury or interfere later on. My hunch is that it would not, and my other hunch is that it would probably be helpful in some ways. Sure. Please.
We have two more from the web. The first one is, how long are participants being studied each day?
Yes. So in the current study, or traditionally over the past 15 years or so, we've been in people's homes that we've been working with them 2 or 3 days a week for 2 or maybe 3 hours at a time. So what we usually plan on is to reserve half a day, at least 2 days a week. That's what we've been doing. Other people have been going to the university laboratories at other institutions, sometimes 3 or 4 days a week, but we've been kind of doing this about 2 days a week or more if people are interested in us coming by. And as I said, kind of 2 or 3 hours at a time. Where we're headed, because we do have the ability to use a percutaneous and wireless transmitting technology, is towards a system that would allow the system to be used when we're not there. We're not there yet. That's a software advance that we're actively working on. But I'm very hopeful that within a year or less, we're going to be at the point where somebody can use the device without us needing to be there. That will again be a research endeavor to see how well it works. And we'll be undoubtedly improving it over that period of time based on the feedback that we get from our participants.
The second question, related to eye gaze technology. So this is one of my questions. I know a lot of patients use eye gaze to control a computer mouse. What advantages does this potentially have over that?
Yeah, so and it speaks really thanks to the question or to the, I guess, list that I put up before, which is always comparing what we're trying to do to other available technologies, and certainly a technology that does not involve neurosurgery, such as an eye gaze system, should be compared to carefully if we're thinking about one that requires your friendly neighborhood neurosurgeon to become involved. The eye gaze technologies, even the very best of them have, and some people in this room may have had experience with them, have their own sets of challenges associated with them. Some of them can't be used outside. Some of them, if not many of them, can get out of calibration if either the desk or the wheelchair or the camera itself has even been moved a little bit, requiring a caregiver to realign the camera with the person's eyes. The effort that some people report in using eye gaze for controlling a cursor on screen can be fatiguing to some. There are people who have had particularly brainstem strokes or ALS who lose the ability to use their eyes in a manner that would be helpful for an eye gaze system, or would make an eye gaze system really continue to be useful at all. It can be difficult for that eye gaze system to be available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, wherever that person is. So we are headed towards a system that's fully implanted, always available. And on the list of kind of design criteria, it should be available at home, it should be available at work, it should be available at the beach. It should be a technology that really promotes continued independence. Any technology that's requiring the assistance of a caregiver is not all that that technology could be. And we think that one of the advantages of having a medical device that's implanted, that's always there and always ready, is the fact that it's always there and always ready. And while the eye gaze can be good, and sometimes is, for controlling a cursor on a computer screen, for re-enabling one's own limb movement, for controlling a robotic assisted device, for having the flexibility and the intuition, that recording from the part of the brain that ordinarily controls the arm and the hand, all of that is, we think, incredibly powerful. But much like any other technology, some people will be very receptive to it and will want what we hope in the future would be the advantages. Other people would have no interest in having the surgery and would be happier using a device that doesn't require the surgery, and that's fine. That is that's exactly the way that people with Parkinson's disease evaluate the use of a deep brain stimulator, which, as you may know, are two much larger electrodes that are placed into the center of the brain in a fully implanted system. There's easily more than 150,000 people now who've had deep brain stimulators for Parkinson's and other movement disorders placed. But either not everybody's eligible for those deep brain stimulators, or not everybody's interested in having the surgery that's required, and continues medical and other approaches, which I expect will be the exact case here as this field continues to mature. Oh yeah, please. Hi.
Projected usable lifetime of the array be, for instance, in animal studies, has it failed after a certain amount of time, or just used to function after a while, for the actual functioning lifetime of the array itself?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a really important question. So and I don't work for the company that manufactures the array, so I'm just going to kind of give you my impression. It's a question that we've all asked and focused on as much as we can over the past more than a decade. There's a lot of animal use of the array. There's about 20 or so, 21 people who've had the array placed chronically. And it's my informal impression, having looked at it a lot, admittedly, that the array lifetime, that is the amount of time that it can record clinically useful signals, has continued to improve over years. And I think that's the result of the companies that's been making them aware of ways that they can improve the process of making the array. I haven't answered your question yet, I will. But I don't know how long the arrays that are being placed today will last, because I think that amount of time continues to improve. What we've generally seen thus far is that we can go in very confident that we'll get at least a few years of good, clinically useful recordings. Now, I'll note that if I kind of take off my physician hat and put on my strict kind of neuroscientist hat, the quality of the individual brain cells or neurons that we're recording may decrease over time, but I'm just going to slide over here. But the clinical utility, our ability to decode that neural activity so that the people in our trial can continue to use it, that seems to be remaining just fine. And in fact, we're no longer using the type of signal that we can record that actually requires the finest, highest resolution of brain activity to be recorded. So I'm very confident now, with the major caveat that we're in the midst of a clinical trial, one of the questions of which is to answer, that we're trying to answer just that question. But that aside, we go into this fully expecting that at least there's a few years of good lifetime of the array. I don't know if we're at a decade yet. My guess is that that may be pushing it a little bit, but as the manufacturing continues to improve, that's a good thing. But one other thing that I'll say about the array technology itself today is that if there were to be a infinitely better or even a moderately better recording system that magically appeared, there's two things about it. One is that could be good because it could perhaps be working for 20, 30, 80 years. But also it would take at least 15 years of clinical research for us to get to the point of knowledge about that system as we are today with this one. So like anything else in medical device development, we've got a lot of information on this. It is working good, maybe good to good plus. And we think it'll continue to improve and hopefully to provide the clinical utility that it needs in people.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Very interesting.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
Thank you. I'm curious to know, has there been any difference or anything measured in muscle mass or circulation in limb that the person was using or trying to use to move the computer?
It's a good question. To my knowledge, there has not been a careful look at the muscles of the people who have been in our clinical trial to see whether there's been any change. Yeah, it's a great question. Something we should definitely consider doing.
Thanks.
Thanks. Yes, please. I'm going to ask you to hang on for just 1 second because I want to make sure there's a microphone next to you. Great, thanks.
The people in your study who have used this technology to perform the same function, move their hand in a certain way or whatever, you find that they utilize the same neuron pathway, or is it different in each patient so that everybody has to start out at stage 0 to try and learn any type of muscular function?
So there's only been one person in our study that has actually had the muscle stimulators that are in place. That is the functional electrical stimulation system. A dozen people who have been +1 who have been controlling computer cursors. And particularly because now we have an approach to decoding the brain activity that appears to allow us to build that decoder very quickly. The array is placed into what we believe to be an appropriate part of the brain for each person. When each person attempts to use their hand, we can record neural activity that's related to that brain activity. It's my expectation that we're going to very quickly, for each person, be able to allow them to control an external device or a cursor on a computer screen. But we aren't asking the person to learn anything. We're asking the person to try to move their hand, and then we're allowing the math, that is the software, to understand the brain activity as quickly as possible. And if that continues to work, then hopefully the person that is using the system, the user, their opportunity to learn will be, once we've given that person a tool that works, it works fairly well, then hopefully they'll be able to get better at using it over time. Did that address your question?
Yeah.
Okay, great, thanks. Yeah, go ahead.
We have one comment from some collaborators at Ohio State, actually.
Huh.
They made a comment that in the participant that they've had with a brain interface, that they did notice increases in muscle mass in their form. I think they use a more superficial FES basis.
Yeah, some great work going on at Ohio State using that, just as Dr. Slinsky described, an external FES system. So great, thanks for being online and thanks for chiming in. Oh, yes, please. I want to make sure that the microphone travels to you, so hang on for just 1 moment. I want everybody else to be able to hear your question. I can hear you, but I want everybody else as well.
I got the sense looking at the presentation that it's kind of like one array per function that you're trying to address. So if I want to move my hand, I get an array for that. If you're trying to move somebody's foot, may take a different array in a different part of the brain. Is that correct? And if so, is there, do you see a long-term limit in terms of how many arrays we could have for those of us that have multiple disabilities?
Great question. So we have placed 2 arrays in our BrainGate research. I'll come back to the important question that you asked in just a moment. There have been other people who have placed 4, and I think most recently one of the sites has placed 6 arrays. So I don't think there's a race to place as many as possible, but as I understand, 6 is the most that I know of, at least that's been placed in a person in a clinical trial context. The arrays in the motor cortex, there's probably a lot of different types of information that can be recorded from the individual neurons in any one location, which is an ongoing kind of field of research. And so we're learning more about that. But you're right in that the opportunity to record from different parts of the brain, which likely have, at least roughly speaking, different types of information encoded or extractable from those different parts of the brain, will make it that much more likely that in the future, there can be multidimensional movements of multiple limbs. Now, maybe it's going to be possible to do that from fewer arrays than we may be thinking kind of in our minds at the moment, but at least at a first pass, even if there's a lot of information that can be recorded from one site in the brain or one site in the motor cortex, another array in another motor-related area of the brain may have not only different types of information about different limbs, but also different parts of the plan to move. Even whether it's a carefully thought out movement that's planned minutes in advance or just the spontaneous reach or attempted reach for a cup of coffee, there's lots of different parts of the brain that are involved in the planning of that movement, even if they're just tens of milliseconds ahead of the actual movement. And being able to understand and record from those and decode those in real time will undoubtedly make it that much better and smoother and more reliable and intuitive of movement. So I suspect that part of the progress in the field will be recording from multiple areas and getting a sense for what are the right number of sites to be recording from at any moment in time. Yeah, please.
Thank you for that great talk. I think we're going to have to end it here. Dr. Hochberg will be here for questions for a few minutes, but anyone that needs to make it for a scheduled ride that they won't mysteriously just leave.
Yeah, very important.
Thank you again for a fantastic talk and showing all this great research.
Thank you very much. Thanks so much for coming out. And thank you online as well.
And just as a reminder, the next Knowledge in Motion talk is October 17th. Be sure to drop your surveys at the back. There's also handouts for Dr. Hochberg's study, and there's a bunch of them over there, and some doggy bags, to-go containers, so feel free to take out. Thanks.
All right, have a good night.